Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out and taking the time. And thank you to Lauren and Amanda and the rest of the team for putting this entire event together. It's really great to be here at GW. Can you all hear me okay? I think it's back there. Great. So I'm going to keep it pretty informal because I know there's a ton of really interesting and good experiences in the audience. And I'd love a chance to open this up more for discussion, so you get a chance to talk about your experiences, ask any questions, have any comments or criticism of my talk. But as way of introduction, so I'll say a couple of quick words and then we'll open it up. But as way of introduction, my name is Kunal Mehta. I'm a recovering investment banker, an author, and an entrepreneur. A few years ago, I left my job on Wall Street in search of some more inspiring or entrepreneurial work. And as you can imagine, I hit several heartbreaks and failures along the way. I've since bounced back. I'm now a venture investor in New York with Hearst Ventures. I previously started a company called Unfold, which is a mobile content startup that we exited recently. But more importantly, and where I'll spend a lot of my time talking about today, is I spent a number of years after Wall Street working with a nonprofit Charity Water that's provided clean and safe drinking water to over 10 million people worldwide. I think that's impact that really matters. Many of us, and I think this goes along well with the theme of today, is business students. Many of us face a very tough and agonizing decision every single day, and it's a decision that I'm hoping our conversations today and in the coming weeks and coming months will help make it a bit easier for you to get through. But that decision is, do you pursue the high status, high profile, high paying jobs that the BCGs, the McKinseys, the Goldman Sachs, the JP Morgans offer, where status, reputation, payment is pretty irrefutable? Or do you break away from the path, follow your passions, and pursue a career a little bit different, a little bit off the beaten path, where career fulfillment and satisfaction might be more attainable? That's a pretty tough and agonizing decision that college graduates face every single day, and it's a decision that I'm hoping that today we can get through and we can help inspire a new conversation around that. What helped me get through that decision was through a series of conversations with some of the greatest entrepreneurs of our generation. And these conversations happened at very raw moments in their careers. It happened on one side of the spectrum with the 18 or 19 or 20, 22-year-old who began building a startup venture. One of your peers stumbled on some early successes, maybe most of them lucky, raised a ton of venture financing, and within the end of the year found themselves on the cover of all the big blogs and tech journals and magazines, and found that entrepreneurial fame that so many of us crave. They found that meaning. But instead, we've heard that story so often, it's been beaten to death. I want to focus on the other side of the spectrum. I want to focus on the men and women in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s who had been building for 7, 8, 9, 10 years towards something that they truly cared about, something that they believed would be disruptive, something where they thought they could have an impact and create a life for themselves, but never found that same type of entrepreneurial success or fame. But regardless of where they were on the spectrum, they were building with this fire in their stomach. And every single morning they would wake up and build towards something they truly cared about. And that was inspiring for someone like me who was sitting on Wall Street and doing this repetitive job over and over and over again. I've since taken these conversations and I've published them in Disruptors for the purpose of trying to start this dialogue and inspire more college students and young professionals to pursue work that they truly care about and showing them that there's a career path to do so. And I've been on the book tour for a number of years, and I've been working with a growing number of disenchanted consultants, lawyers, bankers, corporate escapees, and people who want to do something different and they want to be someone different, but they don't know how or where to begin. So I can empathize with them. When I was 17, I was offered a full scholarship by JP Morgan to attend the NYU Stern School of Business. And at the time, Wall Street seemed like the greatest profession to be in. Books like Liar's Poker, movies like Boiler Room, Today's The Wolf of Wall Street glamorize this career to make it seem like it's this great foundation from which you'll launch off from. You'll build a huge savings account, you'll have career fulfillment and satisfaction, and you'll build this transferable skill set, and then you'll all of a sudden, when you're 40, be able to do exactly what you care about and what you love. And I was one of the youngest bankers on Wall Street, but pretty soon reality started to set in. So at 17, I'm working there, and at 20, I realized just how much I hated it. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to be someone different. I didn't know where to start or where to begin. And everywhere I looked, the worst part is that there were my peers who had graduated from colleges around me or from high schools or never went to college, and they decided to pursue work that they cared about and were now having meaningful success and meaningful impact in areas that they believed they could have a disruptive or create disruptive innovation in. So they're working in fashion, in retail, in social impact, in tech, in gaming, in whatever area or industry that you're inspired or interested in. They had followed their passions and were pursuing that while I was there doing this repetitive job that I really didn't care about so much. And the other thing about my current role was that I was building this false sense of confidence by sitting in this role every single day. Again, your bank account starts to get lush with cash, you are wearing a nice suit, you're being told by your managers that you're with the smartest and brightest from across the country that have now secured these jobs. And you build this false sense of confidence and think you too can go and make your mark and create an entrepreneurial endeavor and succeed within a year and have $1 billion valuation on your head as well. So in that false sense of confidence, I marched into my boss's office and I told him I quit. I told him I want to do something different, I want to be someone different, and this is where it starts. And in that same false sense of confidence, he kind of nodded along, kind of patted me out. He had seen it before. He had seen entitled people like me come up to him and say that. So in that same false sense of confidence, I marched through the exit doors and I saw this empty canvas. I'm like, you know what, this is where it begins. This is where I'm about to be the next Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, and this is where it starts. So in that false sense of confidence, I marched out and I saw this white canvas. I'm like, I can build whatever I want, and it's going to start to make sense pretty quickly. A couple of days passed by. I'm all excited and buzzed up. Maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. By the end of the month, I realized I had no idea what the hell I was actually doing. I had no direction. I couldn't find inspiration. I realized that it was good that I had made that decision to leave, but I didn't know what the next step was. And every mentor I would now reach out to and friends who had basically pushed me to make that decision were now looking at me like very skeptically, like why I had actually made this decision to leave a secure job during one of the greatest recessions our generation had ever seen. So it was pretty trying, because every time you're out with your friends now, you're trying to decide whether you should swipe your credit card, because you don't know when the next check is coming in. And you've decided to be an entrepreneur, and all you see on every single blog and tech journal are the entrepreneurs that are succeeding, but you have no sense of where they got started. So what I understood was that there had been hundreds of people before me that had left positions of security or conformity to pursue work that they cared about. There'd be hundreds after me. I needed to just go and sit with them and understand from them what that path looked like. What does that career path look like when you want to leave that position and do something on your own? So I set out to talk to men and women, and I wanted to understand how the resilience and persistence did they eventually become the Scott Harrisons and the Jack Dorseys and the Lauren Bush Laurens and the Richard Bransons and the Vin Vacantis and the other entrepreneurs that I eventually speak to for Disruptors. But I didn't want to focus on that ivory tower story that we had been used to hearing so often about the people that had succeeded and their venture rounds of financing and how disruptive their products were, and these tailored press releases that had become they could be attributed to the entire startup generation that was going on. I wanted to understand the raw moments. I wanted to understand in those 6 months when they went to their parents and told them, maybe I need to move back home, or their spouse or their boyfriend or their girlfriend dumped them because they couldn't see career direction anymore, or their first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh prototype of a company failed, or they declared bankruptcy. What did those actual real-life stories look like, and how do they bounce back? How do they find careers after that point? And through these conversations, some interesting themes started to emerge. So I want to plant an idea in this room, and I hope it becomes a basis for a lot of what we can do or we can discuss about. But it's this idea of embracing failure, realizing optionality, and thinking a bit differently about the careers that you'll eventually pursue. So I know this is a pretty obvious question. I'm going to ask it anyway. How many of you are familiar with a company called Spanx? I think, yeah. All right. It's the Women in Business Conference. Well, for those who don't, it's a shapewear and undergarment company. It's going to be pretty funny that I'm talking about Spanx. When you guys could probably teach me a lot more. But it's a company started by, I'll talk about the entrepreneurial side, but it's a company started by Sarah Blakely, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with now also. She's one of the youngest females on the Forbes billionaire list. And what Sarah credits to her success, which I thought was really interesting, is that every single night when she would come home, she says in her interviews that her father pushed her to fail. And I think that's a wild concept, and that's what she credits her success to. Right? That's wild that which father pushes daughter to fail. What kind of loving, encouraging father would want to see their daughter fail? But when we got deeper in the interview, what she was saying was that every single night when she would come home, her father would ask her, Sarah, what did you fail at today? And if she didn't have a good enough answer, if she hadn't taken a big enough risk, she had disappointed him. And that's what he was trying to do, is switch her thinking. He was trying to get her to think outside of that structured, conformed path that we operate in, from middle school, where you're starting to check certain boxes and narrow in order to get into the high school of your choice. And then from high school, you check a few more boxes in order to get to the college of your choice. And then from college, it's just a mad race in order to check all the boxes in order to get that first job. And then after that, they put a performance review cycle on you every single year for certain boxes that you have to check. So there's a little bit less room for creativity. I know that's a naive way of thinking about it, but there's very little room for thinking outside of that structured box, thinking of where can I take a risk, because we are trained in order to think that if you take a risk, this could end in a way that you might not be able to bounce back from. So what her father wanted her to do was to think outside of that. Let her know from an early age that if you take these risks, and they're calculated enough, you'll always wake up the next morning and you'll figure out a way to bounce back. And he was thinking of how can he train her to have that resilience to break through each of these risks that she takes and these failures in order to find what she truly cares about and build that strength of character. And that strength of character and that resilience ended up leading her through a bunch of failed experiments and career options until she eventually landed on Spanx. And if you hear, I don't know how many of you hear this podcast called How I Built This, but if you hear that podcast, you'll hear firsthand about how many failures she faced early on, and how she actually got a lot of the first contracts in the beginning. And it was all due to her resilience, which I think was founded based off of her father pushing her to fail. So you might tell me, okay, that's only one story, and failure's become this very touted word that everybody's talking about now, how it's important to fail. And that's what I thought too. I'm like, okay, this is one person that's kind of glossing it over. And this wasn't a theme that I was going into Disruptors looking for. I was looking for inspiration. But every single founder wanted to talk about their failures. And they wanted to talk, and they were very proud of them. They wore it like a badge of honor because they thought they learned from each of them quickly. And these were calculated failures, where the first one might have taken 3 weeks to bounce back from. But they started to learn a very cyclical, iterative process on how to experiment and learn from them and move forward. So the next founder, another quick story I'll tell you about, is a guy named Kunal Mehta. There's no Indian males in the crowd, but Indian females might face the same problem that he did and that I do of going to your parents and saying, I don't want to be a doctor. That's like a huge no-no in an Indian family. So he went to them and said, I don't want to be a doctor. And he said, I want to do business. So he went and still secured a job with Goldman Sachs after graduating from Wharton, the undergrad school. And he decided that's not the kind of business I want to do. I want to start my own. I want to see if this can work. And this was in the tech craze of the 90s, so right before the bubble crashed. And he secured $2 million in venture financing based off of his pedigree. He started building a company that was basically to find events near you. It was a modern-day Foursquare meets Pulsed meets a couple of other companies that are like that now. And he launched this company, scaled it up, hit those lucky successes, but then a lot of the people who were paying him were clients that ended up failing during the tech bubble when it burst, and his company also failed. He had to file for bankruptcy. So now imagine at 21, you've told all of your friends, I'm not going into medicine, I'm not going the secure career path of business, I'm going to go and try to launch my own company. They say, okay. Then you go out there, you find a product that you want to work on, you raise $2 million on it, and that chip on your shoulder starts to get a little heavier. And then you go and tell them that. They're all looking at you, see what happens next. And then, all of a sudden, a couple of months later, you're now filing for bankruptcy. They're all in these great positions of being paid well. They're being successful by all intents and purposes. And now you're sitting on your butt trying to figure out exactly what the direction looks like. So filing for bankruptcy at 22 or 23 is a pretty cathartic moment of self-reflection where most people would turn around and say, you know what, I'm going to get a secure job and I'm going to move on. This entrepreneurial experiment wasn't for me. Instead, what Nahal knew was that entrepreneurship and making your mark and having a meaningful impact means taking a couple of years of getting better at it, the way a doctor takes 10 years to become a physician, the way the best traders on Wall Street have taken time to actually understand the models that they're working towards. It takes 10 or 15 years to become the best at what you're doing. So he said, okay, for entrepreneurship, that's the same thing. He tried to build the venture in a more scalable process, took redeeming qualities of the first venture that failed, built it out again, and then sold that company to Omnicom within 4 or 5 years. He's since started 4 different companies. He sold a couple of them, and now he just launched his 4th venture capital fund for $100 million to invest in mobile startups. He's something in his late 50s or early 50s. So these stories kept coming up again and again, but what I want to talk about now for a little while before I wrap up is Charity Water. And he, the founder of that, imbibes his qualities of embracing failure and realizing optionality pretty well. But Scott Harrison is the founder of Charity Water. So Charity Water's mission is to provide clean and safe drinking water in developing countries. It's an incredible organization, great brand, you should check it out. But what Scott was before this is a story that's also not so often told, was he was a nightclub promoter in New York City in his mid-30s, and he represented all things vice. Budweiser and Bacardi were paying him to drink their alcohol publicly, which for many college students is probably like a dream job. And he had a beautiful loft in the city. He lived beyond that velvet rope where you kind of walk by and wonder, who is that person across the velvet rope? Bringing in models, dating models. He had a beautiful loft, was driving a nice car. But when he was gambling and doing drugs and put to Deleste, mid-30s, he hit this moment of self-reflection where he wasn't proud of the legacy he was leaving behind, wasn't proud of what he was doing every single day, and like most people at a midlife crisis, decided to go and volunteer in Africa. So he sold all of his possessions, and he said, I'm done. I want to go and see what's going on, and why can I help? Can I actually create a meaningful impact with my work? And no organization, none of these amazing organizations that were working there would hire him. They said, you don't really offer any value to us. You're a nightclub promoter. So he had to pay them to actually go and work there. He paid them, he sold all his possessions, paid them to go there, and he worked on an organization called Mercy Ships, and what Scott saw there is something that I had the privilege of seeing a couple of years ago, where we were driving in Ethiopia for about 6 or 7 hours through completely barren land. There was nothing there, not even a well-paved road. It was all dirt road, and end up in a school in the middle of nowhere. It's very dry terrain, but a lot of people come there, a lot of students come there to this school after walking a couple of miles to get there every morning. And their only water source was this narrow, we hiked down about a mile, and there's this narrow stream where there was donkeys defecating, some of the children were playing in it, there were tadpoles, moss, algae. I mean, you can imagine it. You can imagine what this looked like. But somewhere along the stream was also a woman, because this was their only water source, was a woman she was responsible for bringing, that is the way that system works, is where the woman walked 5 or 6 hours every morning to come and get water from this local watering source. And she had to take the water in one bucket, pour it through her dress to block out the sticks and the insects and all the other nasty things, and pour it into another bucket that then she would then take home to cook with, to feed her family with, for them to drink water from. So this was something that Scott saw, and this was leading to illnesses like dysentery and diarrhea and flesh-eating bacteria and a lot of the other problems that when we go abroad that we suffer from just for one night, but they don't have the medication or anything to actually deal with this. And this water was worst. I mean, we poured it into a glass and it was dark brown and muddy. So Scott said that water is a basic and elemental need that everybody deserves. If I go back home, this isn't a mission like something in fashion or gaming. This isn't something that a venture capitalist is going to turn to me and say, well, do people really need clean water? And he said, I can rally people around this mission when I go home. So he took pictures, brought them back home, and tried to raise funding for it. And most people just didn't trust the nonprofit model. They turned to him and said that nonprofits are this black hole of funding. You put $1 in, you're not really sure how much is going to the people in need. And Scott kept facing that challenge for about a year where he couldn't gather enough support for this basic elemental need of water, and realized that he needed to think a little bit differently, take some innovative approach to nonprofits the way other people hadn't in the past, or some had tried, but he wanted to change the way that nonprofits function. So he flipped the model on its head, heard from customers, and said, you know what, I'll give 100% of public donations directly to the field, and I'll figure out my overhead costs in another way, which I'm happy to walk through on how they did that. And that started to resonate with donors, and they started to give money. And then he said, for transparency purposes, I'll also attach GPS coordinates to these water points through local partners, and we'll show you exactly where your dollar ended up. And that started to resonate a little bit more. So in the last 10 years, he got past those early failures and then started to realize we need to rebrand the way nonprofits function as well. So how does an Apple or an Airbnb look at their product? Why can't we look at the nonprofit the same exact way and rebrand a charity to now say that you're a person sitting in GW, there's someone exactly like you sitting in Ethiopia who lacks basic clean water. How can we provide for them and how can we support that, as opposed to objectifying them and showing them as someone that we're supposed to be helping. And it's worked. And in the last 10 years, so I spent a number of years there, in the last 10 years, Charity Water has provided, again, clean and safe drinking water to over 10 million people. They are doing this in over 30 different countries. And it's a really incredible mission that I would definitely suggest you guys check out. I'll wrap it up and I'll open it up for some questions. But before I do, I know that the entire startup movement and venture, and maybe I'm talking to you, and many of you have your full-time jobs already set. I regret the entrepreneurism escape from corporate America. Right? Because the subtitle was to say that if it's not for you, and if you're not happy in that, find opportunity. But there's a lot of people that are, and I think that's great for them. But if you have that nervousness within you, so startups that are always bashing corporate jobs, there's nothing wrong with those. Those are amazing jobs. Those are an incredible place to have a lifestyle. But it's just this startup revolution has become more about the branding. It's less about building a product. It's more about who's tweeting what and who's blogging about what. And so what I would urge you is that if you do pursue a startup or entrepreneurship, even though I work in venture, don't look at it from the perspective of how can I make my mark in a multi-billion-dollar valuation company. I think I would look at it more in the perspective of how do I create a meaningful lifestyle for myself where I'm inspired every single day by the work that I'm doing, and how can I create an impact with the work I'm doing as well. And if that's entrepreneurship at a corporate, or if it's entrepreneurship by yourself, go for it, and I'm happy to help in any way possible. And I'd love to open it up for any questions or comments that you guys might have about this as well. Yeah.
My name is Shota, and I'm a sophomore in the business school. I have a passion for music production, and I want to be a recording artist, but it's been hard for me to sort of put myself out there. And honestly, my heart's been beating this whole time. I wanted to say this ever since you started talking. So I noticed people don't validate you until it's validated by someone else. So when you first put yourself out there, how did it feel when people started to really validate you? I mean, you have your name on a book here, and you're talking to us here, so once you put yourself out there, like, how did it feel when people finally started to validate all your hard work and everything, and just how did you?
That's really nice, and that's very brave of you. But I mean, there's a lot of areas where I haven't been validated. So I'll start with those too. I mean, I tried to launch a startup, Unfold, and I said exit it, but it wasn't a good exit. It was, we tried, and we worked really hard for a year and a half, and I would put the product in front of people and show them what I had built, and it's so easy to rip someone apart because, I mean, that's what you're doing. You're essentially trying to validate and get feedback from that. When I had first quit my job and I was looking for validation on my decision, I think the biggest mistake that I made was to try to find advice and mentorship from 50 different people. But the 50 people I was going to weren't people that were like-minded with me. They didn't understand what I was looking for from my job or from my career. So if I'm going to someone who succeeded, they might not give you the right advice, and they might look at you and give you the wrong thing, and you go home and start spiraling and getting confused and start applying to jobs again and figuring out exactly if you did what was right. So I think the first part of a validation is you don't need it from everybody. You need it from maybe 3 or 4 people that are like-minded as you, because it offers feedback on your product. So if you are doing music and you want to get advice on what the next best process is, I think find the like-minded people with you. And then in terms of your second question about how it felt, I mean, it feels great to put little things out there and then see how people react. Right, but you can't live and die by that. I think do it only based off of if it's moving your product or what you're working on further. So if it's constructive, then great. If it's not, I mean, there are people that read this also, and I'm sure there'll be people in here that tell me, hey, I wish there was something different about it. I mean, that's just natural. But I think it's that much more exciting, like you said, to put something out there and get feedback on both sides and see. But I think that's what makes it more meaningful and worthwhile, because you're creating your own path and you're making your mark. I think they set this perfect, as opposed to just doing something that someone's done right before you. So then the easiest thing is to say, and it's hard for some people, but it's the easiest thing for me was to say, I'm an analyst at a bank. I know what my next 2 years look like. I know I have to become an associate. I know 3 years I'm an associate, then I'm hopefully a VP, then I'm a managing director. And that's a great career path for a lot of people. That's amazing. Right? A lot of people want that. For me, I knew I didn't want that. I wanted to create my own thing because I could just predict out what it looked like. And I was looking at the 40 or 50-year-olds, and I didn't want that same position. So I think, like, figure out A, who you are looking for validation from. Are they like-minded to you? Do they understand what motivates and drives you? And then B, if you can create this non-repeatable path and create your own path, it's that much more interesting and inspiring. But I'm happy to chat about it more after today. Yeah. Yeah.
People in this room are going to do awesome things in entrepreneurship and grow their companies and going to get to the point where they need finance funding. There's definitely a stigma in the investment and financing world. You're going to find people that are going to invest in general as cash in, and they just want expectations to cash out without having that passion and meaningful alignment that you're kind of to not fall into a trap of aligning with the wrong partners or finding people that believe what you believe in as you grow your company and grow your.
Yeah, sure. I think, so this is something that we face a lot, especially like I was doing seed investments before. So for seed investments, it's really based off of initial traction, early stage, sometimes even a business plan, and investing in the founder. Now I'm doing Series A and onward, which is a little bit further on. But speaking from the seed perspective, we used to see a ton of almost like what we call activist investors, or people that didn't really understand entrepreneurship come in and just throw these huge term sheets in front of people, because we were working as part of an accelerator, so our fund was on the further end. So we still had other investors coming in, and they were from just places that had never really started their own company, or they were just like trying to hopefully make a bet on the next play. So there's two different things. One is cash, right? So if the deal makes sense, then you can take their cash. And if they're not putting like a board seat on your head, or they're not putting these weird like fine print in your contracts, and you need cash to scale, that's fine. So a lot of people, but the second thing is that also that big myth of that you can start and launch a company within a year, it's gonna take 5 or 10 years, and you're gonna end up spending a lot of time with these people. So there's a power dynamic that keeps switching between the entrepreneur and the investors, where entrepreneurs feel like we need to go and beg for capital. It's somewhat the case where you go and pitch people, but I think you can position and always pitch from a power of strength. So if you're saying that you have some traction, I would wait till that point gets to a certain point of traction where you're comfortable with, but at least just start building a relationship now with 5 or 10 investors that you think are value aligned. Go for coffees with them, don't pitch them, understand what motivates them, understand if they actually care about the product more, or they care about the return, and treat it the same way you would treat it as if you're looking for a spouse. Because you're going to be spending a lot of time with them, and if they're not in the same values. So where values break down is that a lot of these venture funds, they need to return capital within 5 years. And that's their cycle. If you're looking to build this as a 10 to 20-year company, and you don't want a multi-billion-dollar valuation, you want a $10 million company that provides for you and your family, or a $1 million company that provides for you and your family, the values won't be aligned. The investor's going to try to push you to sell, or trying to push you to grow aggressively. So I think having these conversations up front is okay. It doesn't have to be you begging for capital. It's like, do we match, and can we work together well? And then there'll be right kind of investors. So venture capital is only like 5% of the pool of financing available. For other resources, I would look at Angels List, Gust. There's a website called F6S, and that has a lot of grants and non-dilutive funding. So non-dilutive funding right now is the best, because there's nobody that owns your equity. The other thing is, I don't know if Dorm Room Fund and Rough Draft Ventures are present on GW's campus, but if they're present on any of the DC campuses, you can apply for them. Those each give $25,000, basically non-dilutive at this point. But we can talk about more financing options after also. But yeah, I think it's more just like aligning values for a long-term approach and seeing what outcome they're looking for too.
Could you talk more about your time on Wall Street when you were 17? If you think the major factor that
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I loved it when I was there from like in the early days. I thought it was really interesting, it was inspiring. I think where it started to hit me was when I was 20 or 21 and realized that it wasn't changing from 17. Like I was still doing the same job, which I guess is normal, and it's part of that entitlement that I was talking about. But I was also there during a really interesting time when I came in at the peak, right before the crisis, and then a couple of months in, Bear Stearns failed. So then I saw it right through the trough and then come up. So I think that brought out some of the uglier sides of it, which probably impacted my experience as well, where I'm seeing a manager that I really liked getting escorted out. And just like, so experiences like that shaped my entire perspective. I do think it probably accelerated my burnout just because I got to see a lot more. So I've had friends that have burned out at 23 or 24. Not even burnout, but just get disillusioned that they want to do something different. But I think in some ways it was a little bit of a privilege because I didn't get that hook or that taste of money. Because for them, when they get that taste of that bonus cycle, which you need to survive and you need to live, but I think the contrast of working with people at Charity Water who are doing it on an income and living and having a great time in New York, and then those that are making 3 times their amount and living the same lifestyle but just at work a lot more. So I started to see that I can still survive on a lower income. I mean, the experience itself, I learned, they talk about transferable skills a lot. right? I think it depends which group you're in, or what side of the bank, or what side of a consulting company you're in. I don't use finance at all now in venture capital, really. I think what it did help with was put this label on my resume that when I did apply for charity award, or I did apply for another role, or when I went out to investors to raise my seed round, it showed that I'd done like the bare minimum of what that corporate was looking for. But other people have defined that in a different way. They've defined that through their own startup, or they defined it through a unique experience. So it kind of depends what role you're looking for. I don't know if that answers it, but yeah, I mean, it was an interesting role where I learned, but I think just didn't see the future in it. Yeah.
Do you see startups and entrepreneurship being cultivated in college campuses, and what, in your opinion, is the main aspect that you can do?
Yeah, sure. So the question was, do you see startup and entrepreneurship being cultivated in campuses, and what else needs to be emphasized there? So actually, the role that I was in before Hearst Ventures was managing investments for NYU's venture fund. So NYU launched a venture fund, also a seed stage, with the idea of investing in NYU faculty, PhDs, postdocs, MBA students. But as part of that, any student or faculty member or PhD that had an idea, I had to work with them and mentor them. And we made investments, and what I realized so the problem was with the business school was that I would work with them all summer on their startup, or all fall and spring. But then when recruiting came around, they would take that parachute option. So even if they had built enough good traction with their startup, they would leave, because I think it was a lot easier to just say, I'm gonna go take that job and not continue working on this. The areas where we cultivated a lot, which I think is a problem that a lot of people don't understand, is this idea of customer discovery, right? Because we have a lot of startup ideas that kind of pop into your head, and your initial thought is, let me go and program this, or hire a programmer, or borrow money from my parents, and then build this. But I think what we tried to emphasize was customer discovery for the early areas, and that's one of the areas that I think every university should emphasize. It's not taught out of a textbook, but there's certain modules that you use where, if you have an idea, can you find 20 customers to go ahead and validate what you're building, and say you do a series of interview questions with them, 10 or 15. That's like the lean startup methodology. And you say, ask them non-leading questions that help you validate the value proposition that you're offering them. So there's a number of examples. So I mean, if it is a content startup like I was working on, we would ask, how do you get your content right now? What's your experience like? What are the pain points? And just further understand, and then take each one of those pain points that they have and try to productize it. So that was something we emphasized. So iterating quickly and failing based off of those prototypes helps. So that was a curriculum that we taught through the fund. But then there was a lot of classes at NYU too, which were useless. I mean, they were being taught from a textbook on how to start a company, and it's not. I think you have to actually experience it and learn, and go out there and speak to people and come back and do it. So I mean, most of the entrepreneurs that you look at too, you'll hear about their last company that they started, but then there's been, Yipit is a company started by Vin Vacanti, and it started on his 13th company, and that's the one that succeeded. But I think what helped was that the first prototype that he built was 6 months. The second one was 3 months. The 13th one took 2 weeks, because I think he got better at that iterative customer discovery cycle, productizing it, sketching it in InVision, and building it out, rolling it out, customer acquisition. So you get better at building a company over time too. Yeah.
So just to go along with the title, Disruptors, in engineering school, we're taught how to disrupt schools, the skills, like coding, all that kind of stuff, but obviously we're not taught where to disrupt. And so, when I did that community in my life, about walk out the door.
Yeah.
How would you suggest it?
Sure. Yeah. So I actually have two ways. One was, because I think you kind of just grasp to an idea. So I had an idea when I left Wall Street of what I was going to start, and it was the worst idea I've ever had. And I realized pretty quickly that wasn't a good one at all. So I think it's better, instead of just grasping to an idea, doing a little bit of this customer discovery process through a different way. So I have one friend who he started a content company also, and he sold it to Facebook. And then when he quit Facebook after he worked for them for a year, he was trying to figure out the same thing, what do I want to do now? And what he did was, he was interested not in finding an idea, he was interested in a broad sector. So he was interested in agriculture. He's like, what's going to change as cities become bigger and we need to use mobility from large farms and get that produce into cities. What kind of machinery do they use? What happens when kind of trucking goes autonomous? And just like that entire system. And like the Impossible Burger, and more people are eating soy. How does meat distribution change? He was just interested in the entire thing. And he wanted to learn where the opportunities were. So instead of just marrying it to an idea and figuring out how he builds it, he pretended he was back at NYU, and he said, I'm an NYU student. He reached out to every single conference and professor and person that's been writing about agriculture and treated it like a month or 2 month sales cycle where all he did was learn everything he could about this. So he went and spoke to farmers, he went and spoke to people who are building the machines, he went and spoke to everything, laid it all out on a map to figure out how the supply chain worked, and started identifying where his opportunities are. He didn't see an opportunity, but then he's done that again and again for different sectors that he's interested in, and then he starts to see it. And it's worked. And now he's working on something in fintech where he looked at the entire landscape. And so there's another website called CB Insights. And they lay out these landscape maps for you of like who's playing where, why are they playing there. And so I'm working on my next book, and we're doing 10 chapters like that on just different verticals so that it can roll out and show where the opportunity is from the perspective of entrepreneurs or investors. So that's a different approach. Instead of marrying yourself to an idea too quickly, of like looking at how does the sector operate currently, what forces are going to change that might need some kind of disruption in this space. So one of the investors for the next book I'm working on, he invested in FanDuel, Pinterest. He invested in Uber. And what he was saying with Uber, what made sense was that cities are getting bigger. Mobile penetration is high, so every single person has a smartphone in their pocket. The New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission has refused to change. There's taxi and limousine commissions all over the place. And he's like, bringing all those three forces together, what's apparent? And then he started looking for companies that on-demand taxi services. So there's a ton of different opportunities that you can look at that way. One other thing that I had done, this was pre-planning, was I think Warren Buffett does this for something in his life. I don't know what, but one of my mentors that I had ended up speaking with told me that while I'm trying to find inspiration, and I wasn't doing much at the time, I was trying to figure out exactly what I work on, this was like 2 weeks after leaving, was write down 10 things that you're super interested in. So that could be, again, agriculture, it could just be photography, it could be adventure sports, it could be anything, within 30 seconds. And then spend a week examining the top 3, a week on each, and so do these sector maps of the entire thing, like what is the landscape, how do people make money in this space, how does that work, who are the people, who are the players, can I go and talk to them, can I have a coffee a day with each of them, and then cross them off if you're not interested by the end of the week. Because if you're spending most of your time there and you're excited by it, and like at night if you're receiving an email about it and you still are awake and want to do it, you're probably interested in spending time there. So then I think just by putting yourself in those positions, you start to see opportunity and working with people in that too. Those 2 things have helped for me. Is there anybody else? Yeah.
So I think that nowadays we're starting to hear a lot of stories about people who kind of leave their stability, like stable job, everything's going well for them, and people who don't follow that normal path of going to college and getting a job after X, Y, Z, et cetera. But it's becoming more of a common to hear those sorts of things. And I think, like, especially in college, there's a sort of stigma that you need to go get your degree and then move on to the rest of your life. I'm kind of just wondering how you manage to find that balance between going off and doing your own thing and having all these creative ideas, kind of going off towards that beaten path while still maintaining that system you kind of need to follow in order to build those connections in a sense.
Right.
Between formality and
Yeah. So I don't think it's binary. I think that's the mistake that I think I was making in college, and a lot of people still do, of saying like, I can either be an entrepreneur or I can work in corporate and I can be stable. I think you can bounce and straddle the line between both, right? So the job that you have and you take right now for the next 2 years, you shouldn't see it as like, this is where I'm going to be for the next 20 or even the next 5. So I think one thing that's worked for me, and it's been working for a lot of other people, is to say that, so there's actually a video from a Harvard Business School professor called Quit Early and Quit Often. It's by a guy named Deepak Malhotra, and he was saying that if you end up in a position where you're not happy, just leave. And that's what he's done with his entire career. And leave in a way that you're not burning bridges, but leave in a way because the opportunity cost of staying there is that doors are closing around you and you're getting older and your appetite to take risk is going down. So now my appetite to go take risk now is a lot lower that is a lot higher than it was back in the day. And so I've straddled the line by just saying that where am I moving directionally in the area where I want to be, which is at the intersection of technology and entrepreneurship. And by being in venture capital, I'm there. But for all intents and purposes, I'm in a very stable job right now. But I have another startup idea in me that I think probably in another couple of years I'll try to do it again. So I'll just keep bouncing back and forth between that line. So I think you figure out that general sector industry that you want to be in, and then you can figure out what your appetite for risk is in a way that's not, let me throw everything and all caution in the wind, but how can I bounce back? Like, what's my parachute option if this fails? So for a lot of people in business, that's business school, right? They do take a risk, and they do it for, they maybe do something structured for a year or two. They take a risk for 2 years, they get into business school, and then they try it all over again. So I've seen that play out again and again, where it's not binary. It's not, if I fail, I'm done. It's not, if I go in corporate, I'm done. I think you can straddle the line and keep finding inspiration in different areas as long as you're willing. Like, I think the biggest problem too is like a lot of my friends that are still stuck and unhappy, they've stayed and they haven't moved. So they haven't figured out a way that's going to make them more inspired or excited. And the ones that have are the ones that have moved the needle a little bit further. And from a failure perspective, again, it's not binary. It's like you figure out what your bounce back options are. So we can chat more about it too. I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has one. Oh, yeah, sorry.
In 2017, only 2% of VC dollars went to female founders. And so what are your thoughts? And so on top of that, being a woman of color, what do you think we should be doing to position ourselves to get those pitches?
Well, I apologize on behalf of the entire thing, but I mean, it's not, I don't think you guys have to change anything the way you're approaching it. I think the entire, and it's shifting very quickly. So there's an organization that just launched by all the top VC funds called Rise Up, and they're doing the same thing, where it's going to be focused on empowering more females, and especially females of color, to get venture financing. There's another one called Arlen Hamilton, and she's focusing on moving that shift. There's been a pact in Silicon Valley from a lot of the top founders that are now saying, unless VCs diversify their investment team to have females, people of color, we won't accept dollars from you. So I think the problem is the shift. The way it happened was that just because, I mean, you see this in every industry, is that the people that are in these positions are white males. And then they self-identify. So I used to see it with my own boss, and we both are great friends, but me and him talked about this a lot, is that he would self-identify because that's where he was raised, and that's how he was raised. I self-identified, and I had my own flaws where I identified with certain things that resonated with me more. So now as we're getting more females and people of color in these positions, they're seeing where the opportunity is because they're thinking broader about it. So I think that's the only goal, is that we have to get more people in positions of actually being able to write the check. And I think there's a lot of people in venture that are working towards that, and we're seeing the shift quickly. You're right. I mean, 2% is like disgraceful, but I think they're seeing that shift quickly. And I would position it more in the networks where these changes are happening. So you don't even need to go to the people that have kind of ruined the system as it is. There's enough investors that are coming into those positions of power where they can do it. So Arlen Hamilton's a good one. There's Female Founders Fund in New York. There's a ton of them. So I can give you a big list of like where all this movement's happening, and then you can just go to them for investment money too. So, yeah. I think that's it on time, but I'll be around. So if you have any questions, ask. Thank you.